So the frontal cortex is shown in yellow. The frontal cortex determines personality, memory and problem solving, sexual behavior, and motor innovation. So the frontal lobe has a major role in a person's personality and in memory. So a lot of conditions as patients age, and remember the frontal lobe is the largest lobe, as that atrophies or it becomes smaller, the neurons in that region begin to diminish. And so the person's personality changes. The person's memory changes because the frontal lobe is affected. And one of the most interesting cases relating to frontal lobe damage refers to Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage lived between 1823 and 1860, and he worked on the railways. What he used to do is clear a lot of mountainous rubble through explosions to clear land to lay the railway tracks. One day, while he was setting up a major explosion, and he was putting these huge pikes into the ground, which would go and form an explosion, he was distracted. And he just turned around to speak to one of his colleagues, and one of the pikes went straight through his face, through his brain, through his skull, and he survived the injury because it only affected his frontal lobe. Now, people often ask, why didn't Phineas Gage die from hemorrhage? If he's got a major pull going through his brain, why did he not die? Because he was studied afterwards, he actually survived. The reason is the pole was so hot that it congealed the blood vessels around it. So he auto-cauterized. Essentially the pole did damage and neurosurgery to him at the same time. But what happened is the people that worked with him said Phineas was a fine man. He was a hard-working man on the railways. He had a great personality. He'd often laugh and joke with us. But after the pole incident, his personality completely changed. And so what this led neuroanatomists and cognitive psychologists to ponder was, what does the frontal lobe do? Because it's not completely necessary to live because he survived that. In fact, his skull is still preserved. And I suggest you can organise a trip at some point, John Dalton, for your neuroanatomy students to go and have a look at that skull. It's not there for life, but it does certainly influence personality. He would often go to meetings and just take his clothes off because he now became sexually disinhibited. Again, controlled by the frontal lobe. So this incident really taught us a lot about the frontal lobe. The other important thing about the frontal lobe that I want you to be aware of is the frontal lobe is involved in motor innervation. So the movements that are controlled by your hands, your feet, your face, a lot of them are derived from the frontal cortex. In particular, a very specific place in the frontal cortex, and that is this gyrus here. Now remember, sulcus was the invagination, and the gyrus, or plural gyri, is the actual brain tissue itself. Now, if this is called the central sulcus, this is called the precentral gyrus, i.e. the gyrus just before the central sulcus. And if that's called the precentral gyrus, this is called the postcentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is involved in motor control, and the postcentral gyrus is involved in sensory, in sensation. Interestingly, along this gyrus, the different regions anatomically send nerves to different parts of the body. So right towards the midline, the precentral gyrus controls your toe movement. So can you all wriggle your toes for me? Don't take your shoes off, we don't have air fresheners, but just wriggle your toes for me. you are using this very specific part of your precentral gyrus to do that. If I ask you just to now move your lips, you will now be using a very different part of that precentral gyrus, a very lateral part of that precentral gyrus. And interestingly, different parts of that brain structure are supplied by different blood vessels. So in the middle, the midline structure of this brain is supplied by an artery called the anterior cerebral artery, whereas the lateral structures are innervated by the middle cerebral artery. Now put the two things together. So this is, remember we said the toes are innervated at the center, the lips are innervated in the middle from the lateral aspect, and the hands and arm are affected from about this region. Now can you see that the region supplying the legs is different to the region supplying the hands from an arterial point of view? That's why when patients have stroke, some of them end up with hand and arm defects, and some of them end up with leg defects, because a different vessel has been affected. Does that make sense? So just by looking at a patient, you can work out which vessel they've had a lesion in. So if we know, for example, and this schematic representation of what region, what part of the gyrus innervates what part of the leg is called a homunculus. So if we know, if the patient's legs and hip are mainly affected, we know that it's this yellow region of the brain, and therefore they've had an anterior cerebral infarction. Whereas if their hands and arms are affected, they've had a middle cerebral artery occlusion. And if both are affected, then they've had quite a major occlusion in both the anterior cerebral and middle cerebral arteries. Okay? So that's the frontal cortex. It's involved in personality, behavior, and also very important role in motor innervation to the body. And different parts of the brain, in terms of lateral to medial, innervate different parts of the body.